Hey folks, History of Retirement. Thanks for coming back. So this is part 5 of 5. All right, so let's see what we've already covered. Part 1 and 2, we covered war pensions. We went back to Rome. We hit Bacon's Rebellion and my 10th great-grandfather. We went to the Revolutionary War and my 4th and 5th great-grandfathers. And we talked about the World War I bonus army. And part 3, we hit the private pensions, and we went all the way back to American Express in 1875 through the Studebaker default in 1963. And then part 4, we finally hit ERISA. We explained why, no, it's actually not that intimidating. It's not that dry. Yes, if you have to do it all day, it might be boring, but at a high level, anyone can understand ERISA. And now we're going to understand some of the current trends. What is this defined contribution? What does it mean? Where is ERISA headed now and in the future? So we're going to bring back our key issues that we've been looking at this whole time. And of course, those are purpose, administration, vesting, funding, and fairness. I think at this point, if you've watched the 4 previous videos, you know all of these, but let's just hit them again. They are going to continue to be valuable just for understanding at a basic level what's going on here. And let's do a recap of what we've seen. We talked about my ancestor, Pedro Ferdinandos. We discussed Revolutionary War pensions. We discussed David Driscoll, my ancestor. We discussed his son, Greenberry Driscoll, who traveled all the way to Iowa to find a Bible that no longer existed. We learned about the World War I bonus army and how Hoover sent the army, but FDR sent his wife, and then still said no. We talked about the Studebaker default and how you can promise a generous pension, but it's not worth anything if you don't also promise to fund it. We talked about Jimmy Hoffa and his conviction for shenanigans with the Teamsters pension fund. And at long last, we got to ERISA to talk about how it was meant to solve many of these problems that we've seen. So now, what is the private retirement landscape today? What does it look like? What is 401k? I haven't even touched on it yet. What does that even really mean? Where are things headed? So first, what is DB? What is DC? Well, just at a very high level, defined benefit means that a benefit is defined in advance. You know what it's going to be at the end, usually based on your age or the years of service for an employer. Defined contribution means you don't know what it's going to be at the end. You only know how much you're putting in now. So DC means you put in a set amount of money right now this year, currently, and then it will grow based on however it's invested. So you don't know what the benefit is. Defined benefit is the opposite. You know what it's supposed to be at the end, and you have to calculate the funding today based on where you think the benefit is supposed to be based on your formula. So a little bit of history on how unexpected this shift has been. The IRA was created by ERISA so that you could roll money between ERISA plans, but it was not intended to be a significant retirement vehicle on its own at the time. And the 401k was even less noticeable. It was added as just a little corner of the tax code to allow banks to make profit-sharing plan contributions on behalf of bank employees. It was not intended to be a retirement vehicle, although both of them have become incredibly valuable to the retirement landscape and created a lot of flexibility and a lot of participant control. Neither one was intended to subsume traditional DB pensions. And according to a 1984 Senate report, over half the non-agricultural workforce had DB pensions at that time. Yet 35 years later, the DC plans have completely eclipsed DBs, and unless you are a government worker or a union worker, there's a very low chance that you even have access to a DB pension. So just to go back into one of the reasons for the shift from DB to DC, pension reversions. So at that time in the 80s, when half of workers had a DB pension, most of those pensions were overfunded. So for example, they might have $125 in assets, but only $100 in liabilities. So that overfunding percentage obviously left a lot of cushion for the participants, but it also meant that if you terminated the pension plan, you could raid those excess assets, you could pocket them. So the amount over the actuarial liability would just revert to the company. So if you had $100 in liabilities, you could pocket the extra $25 in assets after you used the first 100 to pay off your liabilities. And hundreds of plans use this, including some big ones for United Airlines and Harper and Rowan Firestone. They all terminated just to get those excess assets. And Congress became very upset. They were concerned that this was not what they intended, that this was threatening pension plans. This money was intended to be set aside, and they were concerned that corporate raiders and other finance experts in the 80s had figured out a loophole and they wanted to close it. And it does implicate purpose, right? Why do benefits exist? Well, you have the fiduciary purpose. The money and the trust belongs to the participants. So if you can just terminate and take it out, does that undermine the purpose of the plan? At least that would be the argument. And obviously funding is implicated because this is a funding issue. So a great example of this is the movie Wall Street from 1987. So Michael Douglas plays Gordon Gekko, who's just, your soulless stereotype of an 80s guy, a rampaging capitalist monster, and he wants to buy this airline that has one of these overfunded pensions. And he wants to take the excess assets. Now, the other characters in the movie, they're like, oh, we'll take the excess assets and we'll invest it in the airline, and it's going to be great. But Gekko is playing everybody, and he just wants to break up the company, fire anyone who's left, and keep those excess assets out of the pension for himself, pocket the money. He's just purely raiding the funds because it's extra money and he can get it, so he wants it. So my takeaway is that this means ERISA movies are popular, although that might not be everybody's takeaway. I guess maybe a better takeaway would be this shows you how people were talking about pension reversions at the time. They thought it was interesting enough and awful enough that it could be in a movie and that it would be the sort of thing a bad guy would do. So Congress decided they were going to tax these reversions in order to discourage companies from raiding their pension plans. And the tax was incredibly high. It was so effective that it stopped almost all reversions. In fact, reversions are considered a very bad result, and plans will be designed specifically to avoid any possibility of reversion, or at least to minimize the risk, because that's just very costly and wasteful. There are certain loopholes that remain for how you can use the overages. You can spend it on employees. You might be able to merge an overfunded and an underfunded plan. But in general, if you contribute too much, it can be very difficult and wasteful to get that money back out. So as a consequence, very few pensions today are overfunded. Whereas in the 80s, before the reversion tax, most plans were overfunded, at least on average. If so many overfunded plans, though, meant first that they were rated for their assets, and that's why we got the tax. But now that we have the tax, we have a situation where no one wants to overfund because that money is locked away behind a confiscatory tax rate. It's an incredibly high tax rate, so no one's overfunding their plan. That also means that a lot of plans are much closer to the line. They're very borderline all the time. Every year they are funding just enough to get to 100%. They don't want to overfund, It also means that it's very important to be able to charge the plan for certain expenses, the actuary, the lawyers, all sorts of other expenses. And the question of when something can be charged to the plan or when it must be paid by the employer and can't be paid by the plan has become very important because that is one of the few ways you can get money back out. So it has changed the landscape and made it harder to maintain pension plans and costlier. So this is just an enumeration showing the money in U.S. retirement assets and how it has really shifted towards more participant-directed assets, participant-controlled accounts over institutionally controlled accounts. So I've taken this data and I've split it into two, and 60% is in defined contribution plans, including 401ks, and individual accounts, IRAs, whereas only 40% is in annuities or DBs, whether government or private. And those are either controlled by insurers or by employers or unions that are running pension plans. And they are not participant controlled. So this is really a significant shift where it's 3-2. So the majority is now of that money is now DC or IRA versus DB and annuity. It's really a significant shift. Those old mega plans that we talked about and the rise of private pensions, they have not fared well. The American Express Company had the first private pension plan. It was terminated back in the 80s as one of those reversions. The substitute plan was a DB pension, but it was closed to new employees in 2007. So since then, new employees are DC only. There is an AT&T plan, and it is quite large. It's actually, through complicated corporate history, not exactly the same plan, but it's a related plan. However, even then, that AT&T trust has both DB and DC, and the DC plan is quickly overtaking the DB plan. So even there, where it's still a very significant plan in terms of size, it is being eclipsed by DC. Whereas for Pennsylvania Railroad and New York Central Railroad, those are defunct as operators. They went to Amtrak or local governments, and their pensions no more. And the U.S. Steel plan was frozen in 2015, so new employees there are also DC only. So all of those old mega plans, they have really been eclipsed, and that's just a sign of the times and how DC plans are really the future. So how do employers sideline their unwanted DB plans? Well, there are a bunch of different methods. You can close it so no new employees participate. It's also called a soft freeze. You can freeze it entirely so even existing employees and participants don't accrue any new benefits. That's also called a hard freeze in DLL lingo. But what's interesting is you can't get rid of past accrued benefits. Those are vested. They're locked in, but you can no longer accrue new benefits. Another option is conversion, which is when a traditional DB converts into a hybrid, usually called a cash balance plan. That's trying to simplify some of the administration, make it a little easier to understand, basically just making it look more like a DC plan, even though fundamentally the benefit is still defined. So it is still a DB. And that's very popular in government plans. There are other options, such as a lump sum window, so it can allow some or all of the participants to elect a lump sum, and then they can just exit the plan, take their money and go, which can reduce the cost of insuring and administering the plan, fewer people to calculate benefits, fewer PBGC premiums. So lump sum window is a good way to sort of clear out some of the participants and simplify things. And the same for annuitization. You can get some of your participants out by selling their benefits to a group annuity contract. And then the insurer that you sold it to, they have to promise to pay the benefits. There are a lot of rules on how this has to be accomplished. You cannot just sell it off and sell it to someone who will not honor the benefits, obviously. There's still a lot of rules and regulations to protect the existing benefits, but you can push people out through this method. And termination works generally with those two tools. So a termination is when you use usually a lump sum window and annuitization, and then the plan terminates because you did it to everybody in the entire plan, not just small segments of the population. And after that, it just ceases to operate. So frozen is the most popular overall, gives you immediate cost savings, relatively little effort. Often the employer will increase DC contributions so that employees are not getting totally shortchanged, but it is certainly the best move for employers and reduces lots of complexity in administration and costs to actuaries. Conversion is very popular if the plan is going to stay open. So if it's not going to freeze, then usually you want to convert it. That will be seen a lot with governmental plans. Termination overall gives the most cost savings long term, but it can be a lot of effort. You need a lot of people working on it. You need a lot of hands touching it to achieve a termination, and especially just to deal with the employees and explain it to them. You also need actuaries, you need lawyers, you need people who will help you place the contract with an insurer. You need a whole team of people to do a large plan termination. And even a relatively modest sized plan needs a lot of work. So termination will give you the most long-term cost savings, but it's a lot of work. So we've really seen a bifurcation of DB plans. DB is increasingly only seen or heavily favored only in union and public employment, whereas private non-union employment, you will very rarely see an open, active DB plan. And I've got some statistics up there, but you can see that most state and local government employees have access to a DB, and by a smaller percentage, private sector union employees also have DBs, but almost all private sector non-union employees, they don't have a DB. And in fact, a third of private union employees are DB only, but over half of private non-union are DC only. So there's increasingly a bifurcation. You can also see that of the remaining private non-union DB plans, those that have not terminated, most of them, the majority, are closed or frozen. So nobody new is getting in. Maybe some of the old benefits have been frozen. No new benefits can accrue. So the old participants are also being restricted. But this is really the way that the private non-union sector is moving. So I mentioned conversion. What's a hybrid DB? I talked about it a little bit. It's trying to make your DB look more like a DC. It includes a hypothetical account balance. It includes a lump sum benefit rather than just a monthly benefit. And sometimes what it is not a true hybrid. It's just a combination of two different plans. And a lot of government employers have done this, where they have a traditional DB and a traditional just regular DC, and employees will have both. So about a third of government employees and about a third of private union employees will have a combination hybrid access. So it's just two plans. It's not a special DB. It's just two regular plans. And many open DB pensions are hybrids. Conversions are just very popular, especially with the government. But even large ERISA plans, for about 40% of them are statutory hybrids, not combination. And that is the type where they're trying to make it look like a DC. And a lot of state and local governments are just using a hybrid. It's easier to understand, it's easier to administer, and it's easier to calculate a lump sum, which is great because then people can just leave the plan with their lump sum. So if we look specifically at Fortune 500 companies and their retirement plans, Willis Towers Watson did this work, and they found that in 1998, 59% of them had DBs that were open to new hires. But by 2017, only 16% had DBs that were open to new hires. And of those 16%, 3/4 were hybrid plans. So you can really see the shift there. It went from 6 in 10 to 1 in 6. It really, freezing was the most popular strategy behind this change. They just close it and they say no one's getting it. No new participants are getting anything. No old participants getting any new benefits. Shut it off, but leave the plan in place otherwise. It saves more versus merely closing it to new people, but it's also much easier than terminating the plan. But conversion was also very popular, and that's why 75% of those remaining open DBs are hybrids. It's just, as we said, it's simpler to administer, it's easier to understand, and it gives more flexibility to administer later to change the benefit levels, and it lets you facilitate lump sums so people can exit more easily, which if you can reduce your headcount, you can reduce your insurance costs and your administration. So for all those reasons, that's why most are freezing, and after freezing, they are mostly converting. So it's easy to speculate why DBs have fallen, why DCs have risen. The easiest answer is just that DBs are very expensive, inflexible, and they are harder to understand, and they offer less control. DCs are simpler to administer, they are more flexible for employers, you don't have to pay PBGC reinsurance premiums, and they give participants a lot more control. Participants are more engaged, and that's something that a lot of people really appreciate. So you could sort of spin an answer out of any of these things. I've written down for you here a bunch of different reasons, and I leave it to you to decide if you don't like some of them or you especially favor some, but all of these and others have been proposed for the reasons behind the shift. But fundamentally, DBs are just costly and they don't make as much sense. A lot of people understand their 401k balance. It's very accessible, and the employer finds it's much easier to administer. But what are the downsides of DC? What are the disadvantages? For employers, the biggest one is the fiduciary duty and the litigation risk of these new plans. Trying to pick the appropriate investments is something that not all employers have done a great job with, and they're all still sort of struggling with what that looks like and trying to predict litigation risk. There are a lot of plaintiffs' attorneys that focus on this area, so employers have been dealing with that. There are also some administration issues with educating your employees and with making sure that payroll deductions are getting moved into the 401k or DC plan appropriately with all due speed. So those are less difficult to solve, but there are not. It's not without its disadvantages, certainly, for the employers. For the employees, overwhelmingly, when you find someone who is a little concerned about DC or 401k or who just openly dislikes 401k, usually their criticism is the market risk. There are no guaranteed returns. Now, of course, that's technically true, as we saw with plans like Studebaker, and as we'll see later with the Central States Teamsters Pension Fund, that even with a DB plan, there's a bankruptcy risk. Even with PBGC reinsurance, there's still bankruptcy risk, and there are other issues. But yes, that's true. DC does not have guaranteed returns. You're exposed to market risk. There are also other problems, like our participants contributing to their savings, to their DC plan, and if they're not, that's a problem. And there are other issues with if an employee takes a lump sum from their DC plan, are they going to use it wisely? Will they shepherd it carefully, or are they just going to blow it all? And obviously, those are also risks. So we're hitting our key issues again, tying it back together: purpose, administration, vesting, funding, and fairness. So the main difference is going to come in a few points. The administration is different, right? Where instead of calculating these opaque formulas, there's just a financial institution and your benefits are based on investment returns. So the administration looks a little different. The vesting and the purpose are essentially the same. The funding is, of course, different. Although theoretically a DB or a DC, either one could be funded by employees. The DB generally must be funded by the employer, at least to the extent of a shortfall. And the DC is not funded. There's no such thing as a shortfall. It is just the employer or the employee. They just keep putting money in according to whatever the defined contribution is. So the funding looks quite different as well. And then the fairness, we've discussed that significantly, but they start to look very different. The idea of fairness in a DB is to reward seniority. It's more stable. Participants have little or no control. They are exposed to bankruptcy risk of the company not being able to fund their pension. And unfortunately, a DB benefit usually is not inheritable other than a survivor benefit. And then a very different fairness situation for DC plans, right? It rewards investment and saving, and it gives a participant much more control. Perhaps some people would say too much control, but much more control. It can also, in many ways, be less stable, more volatile, yet there is less bankruptcy risk because the money is just already in the plan account. It's already there. There's no future funding promise that needs to be followed through by a company that could go bankrupt. So it's more secure in that sense. And perhaps the main fairness benefit of a DC plan is that it's inheritable. If you die, that's still your money and you own it. Whereas if you die, your DB benefit might go to a spouse, it might go to a beneficiary, you might have a survivor benefit, but failing that, there's nothing to leave to your kids or whoever else you might want to. So there are definitely some differences on fairness and funding and administration. So quickly, what are some of the current issues going on? Well, we've got the PBGC headed towards a default. There is a pension crisis. It's paying almost $6 billion a year to a little under 1 million retirees in single employer plans. It ensures the pensions of 36 million people, and about almost a third of them are in multi-employer plans. It's assisting dozens of insolvent multi-employer plans a year, but it's going to go bankrupt in 5 years unless the law changes. The multi-employer program will be bankrupt by the fiscal year 2025. The single employer program is actually stable. It's not in a deficit recently, but so it's not predicted at this time to go bankrupt unless the money in the single employer program starts getting used to bail out the multi-employer. So the question is, what happens when it goes bankrupt? How are we going to fund this? How do we pay for the benefits? Current law would make the participants pay for it. They just get less benefits. They get a haircut. A lot of different proposals have been floated or discussed to make the taxpayers pay for some kind of bailout. Possibly the PBGC premiums will have to go up. Maybe single employer plans will have to pay more to bail out multi-employer plans. And one very popular solution is government loans, which is a way to defer making anybody pay for it, and we'll just hope that somehow these multi-employer plans that don't have enough money to pay their current obligations will somehow be able to pay these government obligations in the future. And that's sort of a Hail Mary. To avoid any difficult situation where we have to make someone else pay for it, we'll just defer anybody paying for it, but the government will backstop the PBGC. So even though PBGC was designed to pay for itself, it's not, and those loans would help the multi-employer plans avoid paying a huge or giving a huge haircut to the participants who could get very small benefits if the PBGC goes bankrupt. So an example is the Teamsters pension fund. This is the same Teamsters pension fund that Jimmy Hoffa worked for and we discussed earlier. As of right now, the pension is incredibly endangered. It's the Teamsters Central States pension. It has 385,000 participants and it's losing $2 billion a year. It's paying $3.49 for every dollar that's contributed, and that is just not sustainable. By 2025, it will be completely depleted, so just coincidentally the same year the PBGC is going to go bankrupt. There have been proposed cuts, but the DOL rejected those, and there's no longer time to cut benefits in order to save the plan. So at this point, there have been acts of Congress trying to give special government loans to bail out central states, but it's not clear what's going to happen. And if nothing is done, the participants will just get benefit cuts because that's current law. There have been some other issues going on with the DOL enforcement. They like to, through EBSA, police ERISA plans for compliance, and that includes retirement and health and welfare. They are not levying excise taxes, but they can force a plan to comply. And if participants are financially harmed, they often compel restitution with earnings. So there are certain popular issues right now, like missing participants and late contributions. With missing participants, this is often considered a top DOL issue. It's very easy to lose track of your participants, and it's especially important to know where they are when they hit age 72. So formerly this was age 70 and a half, but now it's been increased. Just at the end of 2019, it was increased by the Secure Act to age 72. You have to start paying their distributions by then, and if you don't know where they are, you can't start paying them. Now, in the past, it used to be that the IRS and the Social Security Administration would help plans find these participants. The government stopped doing that, even though we know where these participants are because they are paying taxes or they're receiving Social Security. They're no longer helping plans find the participants. So now you have to pay an independent search firm and hope that they can find the participant, with often mixed results. Obviously, this is going to implicate administration, right? How can you claim benefits if you forgot that you have a plan benefit and the plan doesn't know how to find you to remind you? It also impacts vesting, right? Is it really vested if both the plan and the participant have forgotten it? I mean, sort of, right? If you can come back and enforce it, then yes. But if you don't even remember you have it, you're never going to enforce it. So there's sort of a disconnect that technically it's vested, but you'll never be able to enforce that if you and the plan have forgotten. And then fairness. Obviously, should your benefits turn on whether you updated your address? Probably not, but there is not a much better system than making sure your pension always knows where you are and where you've moved, and that includes your DC plan. Make sure to keep your address updated or to take your rollover as soon as you can. And then late contributions. This has also been a very common issue, very popular for the DOL to deal with. These are deductions from payroll to the DC plan, and under ERISA, those are plan assets. They belong to the plan as soon as they're deducted. They don't belong to the employer. They don't belong to the employee. They belong to the plan. And so the DOL argues that you must contribute it to the plan as fast as possible. And that's not clearly in the law, but that's how they've been interpreting it. That's how they've been arguing it. It's rather aggressive. It's a little bit controversial. But they have said that the fastest contribution time is your new deadline. So if you've always been doing it, contributing 4 days after you deducted from payroll, but once you did it in 3 days, the DOL argues, or they often argue, you always have to do it in 3 days. How did you do it 3 days that time, but not the other times? That's the most aggressive they've gotten. But in general, really what it is just you can't dilly-dally. Their concern is that it's an unauthorized loan. You're getting the benefit of the interest for that time that it's sitting in the employer account before it goes over to the plan, and you're not allowed to do that. Also, that the participants deserve the earnings from those days or weeks or longer that it's not contributed over. So this implicates funding, right? How do you pay for it? Whose money is it after it comes out of your paycheck? And it really only applies after the payroll deductions are made, so that's important. If you never had the chance to defer, that is a different problem. That also needs to be corrected, but it's not actually a late contribution. That's a slightly different problem. So if you were supposed to be able to contribute to your 401k and your employer forgot, that is a problem, but that is a different problem. That's not this problem. This problem is only they took the money out of your paycheck and it didn't show up in your 401k. I will also note, if it takes a few days or longer for the money to be reflected on your 401k web interface, that is not a late contribution problem. That's not a fiduciary issue. It is only if it takes long for the money to actually appear. So some people get tripped up because they can't see it immediately, or they can't see the contribution in a timely manner. If it takes you a couple weeks until your interface shows up and says, yes, that was made after 3 or 4 days, that is the important factor. It's not how long it took the interface to tell you, or how long the printed paper financial statement took to get to you. It's how long it took the money to get into the trust. So there we go. Those are, once again, those are the key issues, and I think that hopefully it's helped you understand that ERISA is not so dry and scary. It is actually well rooted in sort of the history of retirement, and that it makes a lot of sense, and it's trying to address some really commonplace and easy to grasp issues. And you know, if I know that this was a lot of information, a lot of history that maybe didn't feel directly relevant, but I hope that it has impressed on you that ERISA does not need to be so remote. It doesn't need to be so intimidating. It's actually a very accessible topic, at least in the abstract. It's really trying to address very relatable, understandable issues. Whether or not it succeeds is a different issue for a much longer series of videos, but I hope at least I've helped demystify and improve your understanding for what ERISA is attempting to do. And I hope that I've also given you a better sense of the history and the long scope of where things have gone and where things are now and maybe where things are heading in the future. And if so, that would be just great. So again, thank you so much for all of your patience. I know that it's been really long, but I had a lot of fun making and researching this. This is a really helpful process for me just to do the research. I really enjoy it. It really helps strengthen my knowledge of any subject when I start researching it in depth. And I appreciate the chance to talk it through and to create this presentation. And if you enjoyed it at all, then I really hope that it was worth your time, and I hope that you learned something. And go ahead and feel free to reach out to me if you have any questions. I love answering questions. I love helping people understand complex or esoteric areas of law and tax and finance and ERISA and so forth. So go ahead and feel free to reach out, but if not, I really appreciate your time and your attention. Thank you.